Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the first of our spring debates in our series, What If? Radical and Inspiring Ideas for Alternative Education Futures. Now, just a little bit of housekeeping before we go on. We're not expecting a fire drill, so if the alarm sounds, we'll take the doors behind you out to Bedford Way, or if necessary, the side doors and upper floor so that we can exit out of the back of the building. Now, as I said when I introduced the first of our debates back in September, these events are really part of making the IOE a hub for debate on educational and social issues. And we're delighted that we've been able to engage a range of famous speakers from the worlds of policy and practice, really to tackle some of the enduring controversies in education. I'll introduce this evening's speakers in a minute. Thanks to all of you who have joined the audiences for these debates, whether in person or online, and your comments and questions have really made these events interactive, so do please keep them coming. Those watching via the live stream can submit questions for the panel via hashtag IOE Debates. That's all one word. Now, this evening's event broaches a topic with lots to say about education practice as well as to education research. The evidence-informed practice agenda has been building momentum in education for some time now. And of course, on the face of it, what's not to like? Why wouldn't we want teachers to base their practice on what the evidence says, be that from their school's data or from educational research, what that evidence says is going to be most effective? And of course, the IOE has a huge stake in this evidence, both as a key supplier of educational research and in terms of our mission to support the education system. But of course, there are in fact a range of views on the very principle of the What Works agenda, as it's sometimes known for short. And meanwhile, attempts to implement it have really revealed the difficulties in realising the proclaimed promise, as well as some possible unintended consequences for practice and research. And of course, many of you will be very aware that a brilliant case, the grammar schools debate, has really been a bit of a litmus test for evidence-informed practice. Research evidence played a massive role in impeding and slowing that government agenda. But there'll still be questions now about really the role of that evidence and whether it can inform government debates and government practice or not. So is this the right agenda for education? Have we framed it in the most fruitful way? And we've brought together this evening some contrasting perspectives to help us think through these issues. So to introduce our esteemed speakers, Daniel Muijs on my right recently took up post as head of research at Ofsted. And prior to that, he was Professor of Education at the University of Southampton. He's an acknowledged expert in educational and teacher effectiveness and quantitative methods in education. And of course, rightly or wrongly, quantitative evidence is sometimes prioritised within these What Works agendas. Sir Kevan Collins is Chief Executive of the Education Endowment Foundation, which seeks to identify which interventions and approaches make the most difference to children's learning and spreading that evidence to teachers' practice. Before joining the Education Endowment Foundation, Kevan was Chief Executive of the London Borough of Tower Hamlets, having started his career as a teacher, and he was knighted for services to education in 2015. Now, we're really delighted that the TES has partnered with us for the What If series, and this time TES editor Anne Ross joins us on the panel, previously editor of the Times Higher Education, and joined the TES in 2012. And alongside, she's on the advisory boards of the Sutton Trust, the Education Endowment Foundation, and Education Policy Institute, so again, a key role in this agenda. And Professor Gert Biester is Professor of Education and Director of Research at Brunel University, London, and NIVA's Professor for Education at the University of Humanistic Studies, the Netherlands. He's an associate member of the Education Council of the Netherlands, the advisory body of the Dutch government and parliament. Geert's work encompasses the theory and philosophy of educational and social research, with a particular interest in policy and questions concerning democracy and democratisation. So I think you can see that we've got a really stimulating panel drawn together for you this evening. And without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Sir Kevan to start us off. Kevan.
Thank you very much, Becky, and good evening, everybody. It's wonderful to be here, and I love the idea of these debates. So what if we really wanted evidence-informed practice in education? I guess the first thing you have to do is address the we, because I don't think the we is that clear in education. By we, I mean the collective national interest. There's too many people who think they own education. It's the prerogative of a few. In fact, I'm much more broadly interested in the national collective interest. And I want to set out three things. I want to first of all talk about the implications and the actions that follow if you really believe in evidence-informed practice. And then I want to talk about the prize that's available if we do take that route. I think the first big implication is that you get the chance, if we're all collectively involved in this, to have a shared purpose around what really matters most. The one thing I observe now after 35 years in education in this country is I don't think there is a shared purpose. I think evidence gives us the chance to have a shared focus on what matters most. And when I talk about that, I mean things like the equity gap, the biggest challenge of our generation of teachers, the post-16 issue for those kids who aren't on track for university. I think the system is pretty much broken if you're not on that track. And finally, the early years. We haven't yet yielded the promise of early years. So a collective shared focus on what matters most. The second, I think, implication of having an evidence-informed classroom is that you get a commitment to mutual benefit. Evidence by its nature secures mutual benefit because it creates transparent information that we all have access to. It's no longer the prerogative of those who have a popular Twitter account or those who have a loud voice or those who own a newspaper. It's a transparent, democratic way of understanding more about what works and what doesn't in our endeavour. That requires breadth, depth, and pace of evidence generation. We have to make sure those things are in place if you're really going to get people believing it has mutual benefit to me as a teacher or to us as a community. The third kind of key principle that needs to be in place, or implication, is that you need free access of high standards of evidence. We must have no paywalls, we must have evidence that's freely available to people. At the EF, we're totally committed to that. And you must have a very high standard of evidence. I think previously evidence has been tarnished by the fact we've tolerated too much low-quality evidence. We've tolerated evidence that really can't be replicated, evidence that you can't get your hands on the numbers, evidence that's behind, if you like, not a paywall, but a kind of a sort of analysis wall, and you can't get your hands on the numbers. So it needs to be accurate, it needs to be actionable, it needs to be accessible, it needs to be appropriate. We haven't delivered on that promise, and dare I say, buildings like this haven't always delivered on that element. And then I think the fourth implication is a belief in empowered practitioners. We're a long way from that. We've got too many compliant practitioners, a culture of compliance. This is a complete turnaround. Empowered practitioners. Evidence put in the hands of those who make decisions about teaching and learning for the children in front of them. That would be a huge prize and implication. And finally, I think in the implication and action, we need to build local expertise and capacity and capability across partners to use evidence. Our leadership is too dominated by compliance being the mantra that wins you the prize as leaders. Our structures are focused on savings and back office work rather than the core business of teaching and learning. We need to build capacity at the system level, at the local system level, to use evidence. But the prize is huge. We're lucky at the EF. We work globally as well as in this country. And the prize is collaboration and transparency rather than competition and black boxes, which abound in education. Who knows what goes on in the most successful schools or MATs? Do you dare tell us? Is there real action availability for us to get into that? Evidence opens the black box up. At a national level, I think it brings trust and a collective attention on what matters, as I've said, rather than the fragmented and misaligned efforts that are currently going on in too many schools. The system itself within the local level, hopefully it builds meaningful partnerships where you can focus on adaptation and implementation So we're not trying to keep reinventing the wheel. We're trying to focus on how do we bring this to life in our community of East London, or our community of Newcastle, or our community of the rural areas of the West Country. How do we bring it to life? That's where the attention should be, but if the evidence has to be before you can do that. So you're focused on accountability and securing, rather than accountability and a competitive edge, which is driving too much of our work at the system level. At the school level, the prize is huge. It's an ongoing, professional, curious inquiry into what works in our schools, which I think, Bill, which is in dark contrast or deep contrast to the focus currently on compliance and ritualized behaviors as we click our fingers or are told which way we must teach and the words we must say in lessons. We open up that curiosity and joy again in being a teacher that's inquiring about how our children learn. And in classrooms, I think we're defined where we can focus on defined areas of practice, and we can balance that with locally defined approaches that work for our children. So we see variations rather than the variations we see too often between England schools, which are impenetrable. Why is it that schools with similar children, similar communities, similar resources achieve such different outcomes? Why can't we get under the skin of that? Well, we can't get under the skin of that because we don't have reliable ways of really understanding what's going on in the schools that are effective. Evidence gives you the chance to open that up in a way that's accessible, rather than being told somebody has decided, there's been a report done by some people who went in for a couple of days, they've written it down as a key finding and now we all have to do it. We've got to move away from this infantilizing of the system in a way where we're told what to do, to take ownership, to be curious, and to have rigorous intellectual inquiry that informs the decisions we make at the teacher, school and system level. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevan. Professor Beester.
Okay, thanks a lot. I'm using a PowerPoint, but just for some bold statements, so some can read it and others not. So I'd start with a bold statement. If we want to make education work, we should not be wasting money on research, which is a different question from spending money on research, but perhaps the ambition should not be to make education work, but to make education meaningful for everyone involved and to ensure that teachers can be thoughtful in their actions. And my concerns are about, you can say, the interface between research and practice. 5 questions. Often in discussion, people look at medicine. Is medicine an evidence-based profession? Well, not really. And here's a nice picture from the National Portrait Gallery in Scotland called Going into the Dark. 3 professors in oncology who say, we always go back to the dark and uncertainty. Does knowledge about what works actually exist? Not really, because the knowledge about what works is often taken as knowledge about what will work, whereas the only knowledge we have is about what has worked in the past in concrete situations. So there is a huge gap between the two. Are the advances in modern medicine and modern agriculture the result of the application of knowledge to practices in the field? Again, I would say no, and the brilliant book on this is Bruno Latour's The Pasteurization of France, where he shows that the way in which Pasteur made his method work was not to spread the knowledge to the farms, but actually to incorporate all the farms into the logic of the laboratory so that the knowledge could begin to work. And that's a really important mechanism to look at in terms of what's happening with knowledge and schools. Can we think of teaching as an intervention and learning as an outcome? Again, I would say no. So that is a misleading language. And that often comes with the idea of evidence, that we assume that there is some kind of input and some kind of output, and that the research task is to figure out what happens in the middle of the two. 5th question, can we make education work? Surprise, yes, we can make education work, but we can't make it work in the Newtonian quasi-causal way that is only applicable to closed deterministic linear systems. So one important question I keep coming back to is the question, what kind of system is education actually, so that the whole question of working becomes meaningful? One point is that education is an open system. It has porous sort of borders towards what is outside of education. Second point is that education is a semiotic system. It doesn't run on push and pull, but it runs on meaning, interpretation, and communication. We talk and we try to make sense, and we try to help our students to make sense. The third point is that the system is recursive, and that's a very posh word for saying the people in the system are able to think and they act on the basis of their thoughts, and that creates interesting feedback loops into the system. So it's not closed, linear, and deterministic. Now it looks like that means total chaos for education, but actually this is a very helpful way to begin to understand how we make education work. How can we push the systems towards predictable operation by reducing the complexity of the operation? And we do that in three ways. We reduce the openness by not having education on the street, but having it in buildings and classrooms and curricula and age groups. We reduce interpretation, again, through curricula and assessment, for example, by saying that is sound interpretation, that isn't. And we reduce recursivity, reduce divergent thinking. That's what we do in teacher education by helping student teachers to think as a teacher and not to think in any way possible. So I think that's part of what we do in our job as educators. We are constantly reducing the complexity. And that's all fine until we reach a tipping point. And the tipping point is the point where education turns into, you could say, total control or indoctrination. And this shows that we cannot evade the normative question that comes on the table when we see that we are trying to make education work. So there is not just a question, can we make education work? The key question is the question of purpose. What do we want education to work for? And there is something really important that I can only mention very briefly, but I think education has to take a concern not just for qualification, the knowledge and skills, also for the socialization, to provide orientation in the world as it is, and for what with a philosophical term we can call subjectification. We want our students to be free human beings who take responsibility for their freedom to live together well and democratically. And these three domains of purpose make the whole endeavor of what education should work for much more complicated. We can make education work, but it comes at a price. And another key question I would like to add to the discussion is, what's the price we are willing to pay for making education work? And we know excessive examples where there is a huge amount of push, and we see the price we pay for making those systems work. There is even the big question whether in our ambition to make education work, we are beginning to give up on the very idea of education itself as a life-enhancing democratic process. And I think we shouldn't, but I'm often worried that we're getting closer to that. And here's a picture about pig farming. If you want to know the background, Google it with my name and you'll find interesting things. And then perhaps the most difficult question of all, I have never come across anyone in education with bad intentions. Everyone wants to make education better, but the big question is, of course, what is better and how do we do it? And much of the discussion about evidence and improvement takes correctly the social justice argument, the argument for equal educational opportunities. But the really big question is, why strive for equal educational opportunities in a society that actually may have not a lot of interest in or place for real equality? That's it.
That's a controversial ending. Thank you, Jack. Excellent. Daniel.
Okay, so I do hold strongly to the position that in education some things work better than other things, that we have evidence about what works better, and in those cases where we don't, that we can develop evidence of what works better. If that is the case, then we as educators have a moral imperative to try and do what we know works or try and find out what works. That is a social justice issue We need to ensure that we are doing the best for the children in our system and for society as a whole, and in particular we need to do that for the most disadvantaged groups who we know are more strongly affected by educational inputs and processes than are those from more advantaged backgrounds. I like the word informed, evidence-informed, because of course there is a caveat to that, which firstly is that it has to be clear that we need to translate evidence into the specific context of schools and classrooms, and there is a translation there that has to happen every time a teacher steps into a classroom. And secondly, that of course we have to be realistic. We don't know everything, and there are still a lot of things that we need to find out about. However, I'm actually quite optimistic. I think that the education system is making a number of steps towards becoming more evidence-informed. I think we have seen a number of positive developments, for example, research schools, the whole teacher research movement, the education blogs that are springing up, the conferences, Research Ed, Northern Rocks, what have you. So there is definitely a groundswell towards becoming evidence-based in education. So I'm quite optimistic about that. However, of course, there is still a lot to do. We still see a lot of fads coming up in education that are not supported by evidence. We sometimes see a naive approach to research from some of the educators who go into the field, and it is, for me as a researcher, sometimes disappointing to see teachers reinvent paradigm wars that we in research think we have hopefully moved beyond a little bit. So the question then is, what would a truly evidence-informed, evidence-based system look like? Well, to me, there are a number of elements to that. I think it would be great if all schools had research leads, people who were championing research, trying to mediate research within their schools. I also think it would be great if teachers were actually given time to engage with research. One of the problems in the system now is that we expect teachers to go out in the weekends and evenings and go to conferences or events, etc. Teachers are already very busy, and in a truly evidence-informed, research-based system, that would be something that would be built into the day-to-day work of teachers, so they had properly time to do that. Also, of course, it's important that we develop then research literacy. I mentioned earlier the kind of sometimes naive approaches to research. That's not surprising, because where do you get your research literacy from? And that's something we need to look at also as a system. How can we build that into professional development, initial teacher education, etc.? Of course, to be truly evidence-informed, teachers need to be working in an evidence-informed system. It's not just a thing for schools and teachers to do. So that means that other key educational organizations, like ourselves at Ofsted, but also like the Department for Education, initial teacher education providers, need to be research-informed themselves. Otherwise, teachers will end up in the very frustrating situation that they may be using evidence-informed, evidence-based practice, but are being pushed to do non-evidence-based things by the powers that be above them. Being evidence-informed doesn't necessarily mean that all teachers have to be doing research all the time. Rather, it means being aware of what works in their subject or stage. It can be very helpful for teachers to do research, but that's not their primary job. So it would be, again, putting an unrealistic expectation on the profession if we are expecting everybody to constantly be reinventing the wheel in that way. So how do we then get teachers to access high-quality research? Because that's very hard. So Kevan mentioned the issue of costs, the issue of accessibility. There's also the simple issue that there is just too much research out there for anybody to easily access on top of their day-to-day work. So that is where I think there is a key role for mediation and for intermediary organizations that translate some of those research findings into a more accessible format, and I would have to say that EEF does very good work in that particular space as well. So, as I mentioned, I think we are seeing positive steps towards a research-informed system, and I think this provides us with great potential for improvement, and I think we are starting to see that in a number of areas already. Of course, we are nowhere near a situation, and probably never will be, in which education research can simply give us the answers to whatever we want to do in the classroom, and neither would we necessarily want that to be the case. Judgment will always be an important part of the educational process. Also, research is stronger in some areas than other areas. There are areas where we need to do a lot more before we can be truly evidence-informed. Evidence is not absolute. Things do work in better or worse in different contexts, and what we need to remember is that always implementation is key. A very evidence-based and proven practice can cause a disastrous result if it's very badly implemented, and that's what we also quite often see in education, which is why when we talk about an evidence-informed system, that needs to be linked to a system of professional development in schools and support for teachers that put as much emphasis on implementation as on simply saying, okay, this is what the evidence says about this particular area. Saying all this, in education, I think we do often actually underestimate what we know. If only we actually used the decades of evidence that we had on many educational factors, such as teaching in our classroom, I think we could make very rapid improvements without having to go through big systemic overhauls every 15 minutes, and I think that is what we should try and do.
Thank you so much, Duncan. And last, but by no means least, Anne.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to pick up on a few of the points that Daniel's made. If we do want evidence-informed practice in the classroom, I'm not sure that we've actually established what it is that we are asking teachers to do. When we say we want them to be research-informed or research-engaged, what does that actually entail? And are we actually asking them to do something that is practical or even possible? We know we've got a workload crisis at the moment, and we're telling every school leader you've got to cut down the work that teachers do. But at the same time, we're also telling teachers, oh, you're going to have to do a bit of heavy research reading on the side. And the big question is, how do you expect them to do that? You know, if you're going to be teaching and marking, after a full day of that, I mean, I don't know about you, but I just want to go back and read a dodgy thriller. I wouldn't want to read one of your research papers, not to be rude or anything.
I don't understand.
Or the TS.
Or the TS, actually. I wouldn't want to read that after a long day either. So, to be research-informed and engaged, however you want to talk about it, the teacher needs to be comfortable with the research and understand where it's come from. They need to understand the context of who did the research, where it sits in the canon of the subject area, whether there are any vested interests, what the effect sizes were, what was not included in the study, and I could go on. And that's a hell of a lot of work to be doing on top of your normal day job. Now, a school could pay somebody, just create a role for somebody to do that exclusively. Again, you know, where they're going to get the money from. No schools have any money at the moment. And how do they assess the impact of that person? How do they ensure that that person will be trusted or believed by staff so that the findings are actually used? And how is that person going to be trained? How are we going to ensure that that person does not pick and distribute research ideologically? So it's probably having a leader of research is a role that's really difficult to get right. And there will be some good ones, but there's probably going to be many more bad ones. So then you have to get the teachers to do it themselves. So we had a podcast last week where Christian Bukova, one of Daniel's old colleagues, was talking about how he reads research, and he says it can take him hours to chase down every reference, every citation, assess the key aspects of the methodology, put the paper in a wider context, and he does it for a living, and we're asking teachers to do all that. And even if they did do that, and even if they did have the time, how many hits are they expecting from this research? We know there's no silver bullets. But we're talking about research which isn't necessarily game-changing, to their ways of teaching, but refinements or modifications to the evidence base that has largely grown up organically through experience. And when you then explain concepts like chunking or cognitive load or memory to a lot of teachers, and they understand, and they say to you, oh yeah, we already do something like that. They've already worked it out, and all the research is then doing is refining what they're actually practicing. That refinement could come about through a better sharing of best practice, and yes, comparing notes is invaluable. And you absolutely want that to happen, is for the research to be one voice in the sharing, but not the only voice. And that's when the teacher will feel empowered, and when the research can be properly contextualised, and then it's useful to them. And by research, I mean broad, non-ideological, robust evaluations of research, of the kind Kevan here does with the EEF. That's really useful. It can lead to compromises and simplifications, but with proper caveats, that's how you get research practically into education. And then we need to leave teachers alone to decide how best to proceed following any of these discussions that they have about the research. And they need to be empowered to use it, or to call it out as unworkable in the real world, in their own context. And there's a trend as well to say you're irresponsible if you don't use research. And that's massively unhelpful, because it smacks of arrogance. It assumes teachers can't work things out for themselves. And if we promote the concept of research informed equals professional as a narrative, instead of empowering teachers, we do the opposite, and we risk deprofessionalising them and undermining them and all their experience and expertise. Thank you. Oh, good.
Thank you, panel. That's been absolutely fascinating. Well, we've had lots of, on different areas here. We've had thoughts on the nature of teaching. We've had thoughts on the nature of practice and the art of the possible there in terms of engaging research. I think I'd like to start by asking particularly Kevan and Daniel to what extent evidence-based practice is inevitably constrained by politics. And just to use an area of example that's dear to all of our hearts, which is social mobility, and which has been, of course, a policy concern for a very long time now. We know the research evidence, don't we, about the very unusually close correlation between wealth and educational outcomes in the UK context. We know even why we have a lot of these unequal outcomes. You know, there's a huge body of research, and that research shows consistently the issue of opportunity hoarding by the more affluent. We don't talk very much about that when it comes to evidence-based practice and what might be changed. We tend to focus much more on teaching practice, how to raise attainment for disadvantaged kids and so on. You know, so my question is, to what extent really does perhaps the political climate and or sort of financial constraints actually constrain the possibilities of making teaching and the education policy making truly based on research?
Okay, so obviously we always work within a particular context, a context of political decisions, a context of financial constraints. So yes, that will inevitably affect what we can and cannot do. However, the trick is then to make sure that we do the best we can within those particular constraints. So we know, for example, you're absolutely right, of course, about the strong correlations between wealth and educational outcomes, but those are also not 100% correlations, as you know. So we do have room within that to make a difference within schools and within classrooms. We know, for example, that when you look at pupil progress over time, the effect of high-quality teaching is as great as the effect of social background. So that means teachers can make a real difference. So even within the constraints of society, the constraints of politics, etc., we can make a difference as educators, and that's therefore something that we need to concentrate on. Does that mean we do not sometimes have to get out there and give messages to policy about why things are not working the way they expect? Well, we do need to do that, of course. That's also part of our role.
Thank you.
Just to, I fully agree with everything Daniel said then, but just to put it another way, I mean, education always happens obviously in a context and a culture. And I just thinking when I started teaching, 36 years ago in East London, that you know, you were given your class and told, well, they're your children, Kevin, get on with it. Now, those children were unfortunate because they got me. Next door, the children got Linda, and she was brilliant. But the variation between the two was down to the vagaries of our own preparation, our own experience, our own background. That is completely unacceptable for the lives of children in the poorest part of London. And I had a right to know more as a teacher, and I had an obligation to apply what was known. So if you take a key development, let's take reading, teaching children how to read. We categorically, in my view, know something about the effective practice around teaching reading. We need to make that, and that's been evidenced and researched over and over again. Every teacher has a right to know that stuff, and every child has a right to receive good quality teaching in terms of the teaching of literacy. In fact, of all the areas we teach, it's the one where pretty much it's unacceptable. We still have 1 in 8 children who can't read by the time they leave primary school. Because this question of not bringing the evidence to bear, what's the consequence? Well, the consequence is huge variation between and within schools. You got Linda or you got Kevan. You went to that school and not that school. It's just luck of the draw. That can't be the way you deliver equity in a country, in a nation, in education. The most important things we do. You wouldn't accept it. You know, just sorry, Kevan, your GP makes it up. This GP has that wouldn't be acceptable in that regard. So why is it acceptable in education? The other thing, of course, is that culture led to huge kind of questions about value for money. You know, we spend, as educators, as teachers, a lot of public money, and we have to be responsible for that. We could do with more. We make the case for more, I think, by spending it well. If you take one example, every kid in year 7 in my school is going to have an iPad. All right, well, what's the education question you're answering? What's the evidence that makes a difference? The money we have spent on technology and education in this country is out of step with many other countries, and yet have we seen the return? No. Why? Because I don't think we've evidenced properly that what we want to use it for and what difference it makes. Every teacher in England is going to do triple marking. You're going to all do this endless marking with coloured pens. That comes not from evidence. That comes from the kind of corrupt view of audit and a weird reading of feedback research. When we looked into that and looked at the evidence and was able to say to leaders and to the system, actually, there's no evidence for triple marking, that became a great kind of way of saying, remove this burden from teachers. But my final point is, if you don't use evidence, what is the alternative? Is it going to be we make it up as we go, and that's luck? Is it going to be, I don't think that is what will happen, by the way. I think it will be the increasing codification and the reduction of teaching to a technocratic business where we're told what to do. I don't see an unleashing in places where you don't have evidence of creativity. I see increasingly teachers being reduced to being technocrats as they're told what to do with increasing prescription in their practice.
Thank you, Kevan. Gert and Anne, any quick words of response, or shall we turn to the audience?
Maybe it's ironic that Daniel is saying we need to invest in schools and create time for teachers to become research literate. We used to do that in teacher education, so it's a bit odd that we now put the burden in schools rather than to say there may be something wrong with the teacher education we actually have. And that's where that should happen. Not just, so there is a big question how we use the word research in this conversation, whether that includes scholarship, historical understanding, theoretical analysis, political awareness. So if we're talking about that, which I think is what teachers need to engage with, that is more than just focusing it on sort of evidence or empirical arguments, which are part of it, but they need to be contextualized. And you need about 5 years to prepare teachers properly for doing that.
Thank you.
I just wanted to ask Kevan if you're going to bet to put those views forward on EdTech. It's on this week.
Well, you know, these IKEAs of education, whether it's, I'm being, you know, let's just have a discussion, whether, you know, these endless wares and wonders you can buy to solve every problem. Of course, remember, if, you know, in medicine, before a drug's released, it goes through a whole, and I completely buy the fact this is not like medicine. I think in medicine, it's more like diabetes, in fact, what we do, rather than something like polio. There is something about the conditions, the background, the culture, the habits. This is what creates the kind of opportunity for children. But in medicine, you go through a whole set of processes before you can release on the public a treatment. In education, of course, this evening, we could have just sat in groups and invented an education resource and tomorrow sold it to any school we liked. So there is no control, there is no obligation to require that this does no harm, which you can do. I'm very sort of nervous about the unleashing of the market in the way that you endless brochures and wonders and snake oil that comes towards us. And how do we build the capacity, the evidence literacy, the capacity to make great decisions on behalf of our children? What is it we let into our school? How did Brain Gym happen? We let it in. How do we build the capacity to demand that the evidence is provided before we unleash some of this nonsense on our children?
Thank you very much. Well, those are really stimulating thoughts for us. So without further ado, let's turn to the audience. Questions? Okay. Got one here and one here.
Okay, we hold up randomized controlled trials as being the ideal in education, or some people.
Can you use the microphone?
We hold. Okay, we have this ideal potentially that randomized controlled trials are what is desired in research and education. But one of the issues is we don't know in a randomized controlled trial, whatever the intervention is, what the comparison group get. In most instances, it's business as usual. So what you don't know is the quality of business as usual. And which means it's very difficult to make really clear conclusions about your intervention. It's a little bit like your football team winning 5-0, but you don't know whether you've been playing Manchester City or you've been playing Forest Green, who are bottom of League 3. So without that knowledge, you really are none the wiser.
Thank you. And we'll come back to this. So we've got one here on randomized controlled trials. Sorry, there's a
Hi.
here.
I'd like to talk about the framing of the research in education. I come from an organisation called Fit to Learn from Croydon. We set up after the riots. We set up because we were so fed up of our kids burning the place down, and they were the kids rejected from education. So we've gone away and had a really good look at why, and we looked at the level 3s going into one of our secondary moderns, and we found every single one of them didn't have good motor skills, didn't have good vision, binocular vision. You need binocular vision to learn, and you also need to be able to sound process. My worry about all educational research in the UK is you have no idea whether the child sitting in front of you is actually developed well enough to learn, and we're doing no checks. Thank you.
Thank you. And did we have one more hand here? Thanks, Kate.
Thank you. I've been taken in the past by Professor Biester's point about what works won't work, and a move from evidence-based to values-based discussion about education. And it's interesting to me that that hasn't come up at all so far tonight. Kevan used the word value, but in terms of value for money, and Professor Biester, you came closest to that. I'm curious to know why it doesn't gain traction in discussion about the use of evidence and what it's for, and how we could increase that. And you know, last year when we were talking about grammars, for example, when it became a very political debate, we didn't discuss values openly, but it was like the elephant in the room, if you like. Everybody knew where everyone was coming from, but nobody wanted to have that discussion about what they firmly believed in terms of their values about why they liked grammar schools. So I'd quite like to know how we could get values to get more traction in the discussion, please.
Thank you for that. Those are really interesting questions. So we've got a question about RCTs and business as usual in control. We've got a question about development and readiness for research in pupils, and we've got a question about values. Should we take the RCTs first? Probably I'm looking to start with at Kevan there. Imagine that was aimed at the Education and Development Foundation.
Well, Daniel will have more expertise on it. I think the point about the the issue around randomized control trials is it's about balance, really. I mean, pretty much when we started our work and we looked across the piece, the one thing we clearly saw that there hadn't been in education in this country that many randomized control trials done. There had been a dominant kind of culture of qualitative research in the education field. So we funded in the last 5 years 160 trials involving 1 in 3 schools in England are recruited to be part of the work. So don't say teachers and schools aren't willing to be involved. Over 1 million children. The trials always have a component which is a process trying to tell the story. But where we can, and we do have a preference, you also have the numbers to try and have the clear objective data. So I think it's about balance. I think it's about RCTs give you the confidence to reduce your uncertainty. By the way, it's not about toolkits and the control trials. They're not about telling you what will work. They're about reducing your uncertainty about what happened in that particular study. Now, the way you get around your questions of bias in the control group, that you're playing Manchester United and not Preston North End, where I come from, well, the issues there are a size. You try and make the trials bigger, so you've got more chance of including a few Manchester United players or City players in the opposition. So we run very big trials, much bigger than used to be run in this country. You talk quite a lot in your report about where the trials happened. Where you can, you do have an active arm, so you're measuring against 3 things, not just 2, and that helps to deal with it. But all the time, what you're trying to do is you're trying to reduce your uncertainty that the thing that, you're trying to build a confidence. This wasn't just chance. Something happened with these children that was the result of this particular intervention. Schools are messy places. The business is messy. We're never going to get to certainty. I'm with you. We're trying to reduce uncertainty. Yeah. Where you said there's been a lot of research. Yeah. Most research only has one intervention versus so why not have multi-arms, high quality interventions? Yeah. And then so we do that. So a good example would be I won't go into a lot of detail this time, but a good example would be read the report we did on Carol Dweck's study on growth mindset. We created 3 groups there deliberately so we could look at the work we've done with Robin Alexander on dialogic teaching. We deliberately try and design them to get to your point. It's never going to be perfect, but so your point is the right one. Can I just say one other about the values, because I think this is a really important point. I don't think evidence helps that much with values. It doesn't really answer. So if you take the evidence on, say, Becky's area of expertise, grouping by prior attainment. So we know something about what the impact of that is. We know that if you group children by high prior attainment, they may, on the evidence base, they may well do better than they would have done if you put them in a mixed attainment group. But the children who are on low prior attainment will do worse than if they're on. So there's a huge values question now for people running schools and running systems to answer. What do you want? Do you want to educate an elite, or do you want to move, the community together? Now, I don't think research answers questions like that. But so my point is, you present the information and you say the best people to work that out are the people who are running the institution, the teachers, the schools, to answer those sort of questions for themselves. The evidence tells you what the outcome will be, likely, or with some degree of certainty, but you then have to answer hard values questions. Evidence must not become another thing to tell people what to do.
Thanks, Kevan.
Can I just follow up?
Sure.
So just to follow up on your question about RCTs, that's very much a research design question, and there are a number of ways you can alleviate that problem. The first that Kevan has already mentioned is to indeed, as you also said, compare different interventions and not just an intervention with BAU, but there are other things as well. There's also how do we build in evaluation of processes into the design as well. Education indeed is a messy business, so we know that any intervention is going to be implemented in different ways in different schools, and therefore we need data on that. And likewise, we do ideally need data on what's happening in comparison schools. So say we are looking at an intervention in teaching, then we ideally want some measure of teacher effectiveness in both the treatment and the comparison schools, because that will affect how well the treatment goes and how well the comparison schools do as well. The third design element to that is simply replication. So one RCT is never going to give us a definitive answer, and what we do miss a lot in education is replication research. We do too many one-off studies, in part because the academic publication process doesn't encourage replication research, and I think that's a problem.
Good point.
And just to add for qualitative researchers in the room, this notion of process evaluation, I've learned through my own RCT work, is really qualitative research to find out how and why things are happening. So I think that is inclusive, and I think it's very necessary in the mix there, in good practice, mixed methods studies. Anne, did you have?
Yeah, I just wanted to come in on the values-based stuff on grammar schools, just to say, I think with the grammar school debate, it was the perfect example of where we had lots of evidence that they weren't going to work, they hadn't worked, and it was all ignored. And everybody just kept banging their heads against the wall. They kept repeating, but we've got the evidence. But it didn't matter, because it wasn't a debate about the evidence. It was a debate about emotion. And, sometimes the evidence just isn't enough, and you can't keep repeating yourself saying, but we have the evidence, because you're still going to lose the argument there.
So this is the point about politics again. Gert.
Yeah. So I hear two people saying education is a messy business, and it's messy. I don't think that that's true. So you can also say education is very easy and very clear, but that depends on how much we take all the dimensions of education under control, and that's where you find the value question. So you can organize education in such a way that it becomes entirely predictable, but it becomes horrible in terms of education and in terms of the human quality of it. So the messiness is not a given, but it's precisely in the degree of messiness that values come in, and where we say, for example, we need a bit of openness in education, because one thing we need to ensure is that children and young people discover that they have the freedom to act and that they need to find out what to do with that freedom. That's another reason why, although it sounds quite, you can say, clean to say we know what the evidence is that produces this or that, the problem in education is that we always have to balance a number of concerns. So if we only begin to drive it on reading or measurable test scores in reading, we are immediately forgetting that we have to do other jobs at the same time as well. So there again, the whole question of values come in for me.
Thank you. Okay, we'll have another round of questions from the audience. We've got two at the front here, and then a couple behind. Can we manage four at once? Let's try.
This is working. On behalf of TES, I would just like to say how pleased we are to be involved with this. My name's Ed Dorrell. I'm Anne's deputy. So
and you can't ask me difficult questions.
You don't have to answer this if you don't want, boss. I worry about the politicisation of research and its implementation and understanding. In the educational debate in this country, both politically with a big P between Labour and the Tories, and politically with a small p between the so-called neo-trads and the progs, both claim to own the research, but I would say deploy it selectively at best. On behalf of normal teachers, who should be policing that? Because I would say it'd be impossible to be a research-informed teacher since the entire debate around evidence is politicised.
Thank you, Ed. There was a question next to you.
Thank you. That was very interesting and very insightful. I'm Keith Lewin from the University of Sussex. Up until recently, I've been directing a research centre for the Department for International Development. My question is an international and cross-cultural question. Tomorrow we're convening a meeting with people from the World Bank and from the Global Monitoring Report. They are obsessed with the idea that there is an answer to the question, what works? Their answer to that question is generally to be found in Finland, Vietnam, or Singapore. I don't think they're right. The question is, what kind of evidence-based findings that you are talking about travel, have external validity, and which should we keep to ourselves?
Thank you. That's a great question. And then we had two behind, if you can find them, Emma. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Owen Carter. I run an organisation called Impact Ed. I wanted to ask a little bit about the potential slippage between evidence and research, because it seems like a way it's often conceptualised is that evidence-based means that teachers should, one, read research, and two, possibly conduct research. But it strikes me that evidence is possibly a bit broader. One, thinking about teachers' professional judgment being quality. A lot of what teachers have to do is kind of intuitive, reactive, in the classroom, the million little things that make up teaching. And two, may sometimes be how do you make decisions, how do you assess things, both of which I think are a little bit beyond the question of just RCTs being available, being able to synthesize and disseminate, and where do you see some of the broader aspects of what we might call necessary for a kind of evidence-based profession?
Thank you. And the last one was just behind you, I think.
Hello. Is there a danger in treating too much of what goes on in education as an intervention or a treatment? We've seen reports such as by the EF on lesson study recently, which may lead some people to conclude that rigorous evidence is in danger of killing off a very good idea.
Thank you very much for that. Some really good questions there. So we've got one on policing the edu wars. That's very interesting. We've got one on whether what works travels and the issue about different systems, different cultures. We have one on the nature of research engagement for practitioners, and one on the intervention and treatment question. I think probably we'll leave that last one for either Kevan or Daniel. Would colleagues like to step in? Maybe Anne, you'd like to say something on policing the edu wars?
Oh, God. Well, we do try to do a bit of that ourselves. I mean, it is really difficult, because that's also one of the problems with having all this research out there, because most people just cherry pick. So they're not, when they're not doing what a researcher in a university would do and come at it neutrally, building on what you have and not having an agenda. They come at it with an agenda and then cherry pick what's going to fit that agenda. And I'm not sure how you can stop people doing that. I mean, unless you're prepared to argue with them all the time. And I'm sorry, I'm not going to spend my life on Twitter doing that. You know, life is too short. But it is a difficult thing. You know, you ask people to be interested in research, and that's what you're going to get. And is it something that we should just accept? That's part of the deal. We just have to live with it. Is it better that they are interested and they are taking part? And sometimes they'll misinterpret it. But at least they are taking an interest.
Thank you very much. Gert, would you be prepared to talk on what travels?
Yeah. I think that's what I tried to say referring to Latour, because part of his analysis is that he says knowledge never travels. It looks like knowledge travels. But how we create that illusion is by creating the landing strips through which the knowledge can sort of go everywhere. So I think it raises an interesting question when we say, are there ideas that travel? Well, often they travel because they... what has happened is that the practices where they can land have been reformed, transformed, so that they become something else. So you can look at PISA, for example, which hasn't been mentioned. It has a very specific definition of what quality of education is, and suddenly loads of countries buy into that definition because they want to be part of PISA. And in that, suddenly the whole discussion about what is good education begins to be transformed. And then in that playing field, the data of PISA can travel very quickly and easily. So it's really important to look at what is actually changing And that's the point of saying a lot of what looks like the application of knowledge is actually the incorporation and change of practices. So data-driven teaching is a good example of that, where you can say the logic of teaching becomes replaced by the logic of research. And there is a worry there whether that then still keeps education intact.
Thank you very much. Practitioner engagement?
Yeah, okay, so key question that you kind of asked was, is evidence broader than research? And the answer to that is yes, clearly so. In a number of ways. We know that the actual act of teaching is a situation where constant quick decisions have to be made. Obviously, what is not possible when you're standing in front of the classroom is to suddenly go out and say, okay, just need to quickly check the research evidence before I do the next activity to make sure I'm doing the right thing. So by definition, teaching can be a research-informed thing, but it is never simple translation of research into practice. It's always a co-construction of what the teacher does and what the teacher knows at that particular point about the evidence. Evidence is broader than research. Evidence also comes from experience. I have seen particular things that work with my kids. Evidence also comes from data that I have in my school as well. So it is quite a broad thing. And what we know is that where we have tried, and it has been tried in the past, to develop teacher-proof approaches in schools, so scripted lessons and things like that, that quickly runs into problems because, in fact, you cannot effectively do that and still have a genuine interaction between the teacher and the pupils in which a lot of the learning is actually happening. So, yes.
Thank you, Daniel. And Kevin, are you able to quickly answer the issue about whether we take all practice as either an intervention or, some form of treatment?
Yeah, and I thought I'd just quickly weave it into a single sort of story, really. If you take something, one of the studies I'd rather give you individual kind of examples. If you take the study we've recently published on dialogic teaching, Robin Alexander's work, it's really interesting how it weaves many of the things we've just been talking about together. So Robin goes around the world and observes the way teachers talk to children and the way they interact with children in classrooms, the dialogue. He detects certain ways of interacting which create deeper thinking and learning in these observations around the world. He turns that into a theory. He's written about it for years, decades. He comes to us, we do a study together where he has to translate that not only into that idea about how do you support teachers to change the way they speak on the run. So someone's point about the heart and soul of the lesson. Not planning, not marking, on the run, how do you change the way teachers teach, the way they interact with children, sorry. And what that creates is a very kind of very thought through development process for teachers, and we see impact in English, maths and science. So now, what do we do with that study? We're now going to do a further study with many, many more schools. So it begins to show you how there is collaboration opportunities to learn around the world. I completely buy your point about PISA. It creates, I think, black boxes and competition. Evidence allows us to open it up and collaborate with each other around the world, and we're working with Latin America, Australia, many parts of the world on this kind of approach. And I think it gives you the chance to get into the heart and soul of lessons, as well as to the point about it gets you to depoliticize this to a degree and get to something which is just sort of insightful from classrooms themselves. I would say one thing about the web, the media rush and all the Twitterati and all that lot. Like Anna, I don't really do much of it. But I just wish that we did this debate in a way. I think it's great that people are having this, but I think we need compassion, we need more respect amongst each other, and we need to honour collaboration rather than what we must reject is not ideas, but we must reject this idea that we have to only have debates in education in this awful, polarised, adversarial way, which I find deeply unattractive and alien to my experience of being an educator in this system.
Thank you. I think that's warmly welcome. I almost hesitate to make my next point. There was a Twitter poll connected to this debate, and just a little bit of grist to the mill for the edgy wars, I suppose. The question was, is teaching first and foremost an art or a science? Well, the results were 71% it's an art, and 29% it's a science. So that's a little bit more food for debate there, I guess.
It's about the right mix.
Okay.
A bit more science.
If you're a teacher.
one of the things that we've been congratulated on to date is having a really good balance of gender representation in questions from the audience. We haven't done so well today, so if there are any women in the audience who want to ask a last burning question, have a little think, because you're going to get your opportunity in a minute. We've got a couple of questions from people watching on the live stream from Twitter. I think some of these have already been covered, but I'll put them out there in case anyone wants a quick feedback on this. So we've got a question from Stephen Berryman, which is, should research literacy training be the burden of teacher training providers rather than schools? Is the burden now in the wrong place? I think that was a point that Gert was making earlier. And a question from Matt Lent. Currently, there appears to be a significant disconnect between the evidence base we're creating and national education policy and practice in schools. How do we ensure government policy is informed by what we know works? So again, I guess coming back to the issues about the constraints of policy and practice. Did anyone have anything extra to add there, very briefly?
Well, government will only want the right kind of evidence, won't they? So
that's why we
get that.
Just to be positive a bit on that, so one of the things that the government recently done, which I think is interesting, is we did a large study on offering free breakfast in schools. And what we found is that not only would the children who receive breakfast have benefit, but actually for the first time, there's 10,000 kids studied, so it's decent size. All children in the school made progress who were in the school where breakfast was offered in the classrooms, because you suddenly, in the process study told us, it's not the RCT, that actually suddenly behaviour of all children, the behaviour of the children who previously were hungry was now different, and all children had more opportunity to learn. So, and on the back of that study, there's a process right now for the government have announced £26 million to make breakfast available in more schools, and the specification is designed around the findings of the trial. So that's, I mean, that's 99 times out of 100, of course, it isn't what happens. But I think there is and I don't agree, you see, that the grammar school debate, the evidence had no bearing. I think actually it was quite a big underpinning of why they couldn't drive it through. So I think we're beginning to see the needle move a bit on the way that evidence is informing policy, but we're a long, long way to go with that.
Time for one last question. Hooray! Bang on. Can we have a mic here? Thank you.
Thanks. My name's Caroline Gibbs, and about 14 years ago I was Dean of Research here. I never thought I'd sit in this hall and hear someone say that the randomised control trial is that what we seek is the best way of getting evidence in education. And that indicates how far the debate about what is research in education has moved. And I'm very glad that we've not polarised into quantitative versus qualitative, because of course we need both. Otherwise we don't understand what the data's telling us. Yes. But what I thought was really interesting was when Kevan was talking about the Robin Alexander work, and yes, he's been beefing on about the way teachers use language in classrooms to help learning. But what you were describing right at the end was implementation of his theory. Absolutely. And it seems to me that that is where we need to move the debate, the discussion, the work, in order to help teachers go from the evidence, however they receive it, obtain it, whether it's first-hand, second-hand, whatever, into helping them implement this in their classroom if it suits. So that's what I would... It's not a question, I'm afraid.
It's a really, really helpful comment. Thank you, Caroline.
Can I just say I fully agree with that. I absolutely agree that implementation is key, and one of the things that we need to get a lot better at is ensuring that what we actually know, and as I said, we do know quite a lot, is implemented and implemented well, and that implementation is properly supported within the system.
Thank you so much. I think that that's a really productive note to finish on, actually. I think it's been a terrific debate, really interesting inputs, thank you, and thank you for being such good sports as well. Thank you to you, the audience. Let's thank our speakers.